Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. Yeah, Will, you're stoic again.
I mean, I'm waiting for your introduction. You haven't introduced anyone in like half a dozen episodes, so
well,
I'm excited to see what you've been able to accomplish with all that time for planning.
Oh, is that what you're doing?
That's right.
I think it's because our audience doesn't respond well to my introductions. We've kind of downplayed them over time because you're so good at it. So I will say I'm pretty excited about the conversation today because I have observed turkeys for years and years, and I realize the more that I dig in, the more I don't really understand fully what I'm seeing. And I think our guest today can help us to understand a lot of that. And we have Dr. Rich Buccholz here with us today, and from the University of Mississippi. And you're a professor in biology, I understand it, and also the director of a center. I'll let you tell us about that, but really excited to have you. So glad that you made some time to do this. I really appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to talk about turkeys.
Yeah. So just for the audience, I was going through several of your publications, and it became clear to me that I think I'm not sure where it stems from. Maybe you can tell us from it, but it seems like you have a pretty intense fascination for turkeys. Specifically, you've done quite a few works over the years on it, and particularly as it relates to sexual selection and traits about males that attract females.
Yeah, right. It was never my intention all those years ago to become like the turkey mate choice guy. Like that was not my intention to be. And but I was really interested in the evolution of ornaments in birds. Right? Mm-hmm. Why are some species brightly colored and other species not? Why in some species are males and females both brightly colored, while in other species females are cryptic? So those were sort of the questions I was interested in when I was in grad school. And my advisor kept telling me, well, why not study turkeys? And I thought, I'm not going to study turkeys. Why would I study turkeys? And she said, do me a favor, go out down to Paynes Prairie, which is in your neighborhood, and go watch turkeys for a while. And it hooked me. I'd seen turkeys in passing, but I'd never really watched them for extended periods of time. And at the time, I was also studying sandhill cranes, and eventually I gave up on the cranes and just focused on turkeys. And that's been most of my career.
Yep, that's a super interesting kind of origin story. We talked to Dr. Jeff Hill, who's one of my colleagues here at Auburn a few weeks ago. And it was his recommendation that we contact you to talk about these topics as well, because we touched on some of them briefly with him. But would you mind like kind of starting out, because we touched on some of this with him, but I would like to discuss it with you as well, like touching on what are some of those unique behaviors that you see exhibited by turkeys that make them different from most other birds? I'm sure they share a lot of characteristics with other species, but there are definitely some novel behavioral attributes that they have as well, especially when it comes to mate selection.
Yeah. So, you've said behavior. I guess I would start with physical attributes, right?
Okay.
I think, at least initially, that's what people are struck by. Of course, they're big birds, right? A gobbler is going to weigh about twice as much as a hen, right? Mm. And so that's pretty impressive. Then they've got that big unfeathered head with all the various bumps on it, and I'm constantly correcting people on what those bumps are called. There are actually formal names. The U.S. government funded a USDA study to give names to those various things on the head. So I insist that they're not all wattles and they're not all caruncles. So, but besides the unfeathered head and the fact that they can behaviorally change the colors, right? I mean, that's crazy too. Besides that, right, they've got iridescent feathers. They've got the beard, right? I mean, what I think there might be just only one or two other bird species that have a modified set of feathers like the beard.
Yeah, I never thought about that.
Spurs, the banded tail, the fact that they drag their wings when they're strutting, literally like scraping their wings against the substrate. That's pretty cool. When they strut, they're vibrating that sponge of fat on their chest.
Right.
So low, in fact, I'm probably too old to hear it now. But I mean, it's super low. When I tried recording it, it's really difficult to record in the field because it's such a low frequency. What else? Gobbling, of course. Yeah. So, and the snood, the fact that they can retract and extend the snood, right? I mean, all the sort of weird things that you might be interested in if you're interested in mate choice in birds is found in turkeys.
Is that kind of why you got hooked? Because they have this collection of really weird, elaborate traits?
Yeah, so everyone talks about the fact that Charles Darwin, who came up with the idea of evolution by sexual selection, that, he says in a letter he wrote to someone that the peacock gives him a headache because he couldn't figure out how the peacock's huge train, its tail, could be advantageous to survival, right? Survival of the fittest. And so basically those kinds of observations stimulated his thinking about, well, there's competition for survival, but there's competition for mating as well. And as I thought about it, I thought, well, peacocks are nice, but turkeys are actually more impressive than peacocks.
Agreed.
And in fact, pavo, the genus for peacocks, that's part of the turkey scientific name, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Pavo part, right? What does that mean? That means like rooster peacock, Galopavo, and so I'm not the first one to make that kind of connection.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, I have brought up before. I did a search through the history, just writings, trying to find references to turkeys, and when some of the earliest European writings, they were calling them peacocks because they didn't know what else to call them.
Right.
Which I thought was pretty fascinating. But then you bring that up, and now I'm wondering, is that I never put that together, that there may even be a connection in the scientific name.
Mm. Yeah, well, the Meleagris part, that refers to guinea fowl. So they certainly didn't know what to do with turkeys because its scientific name is like guinea fowl, rooster, peacock.
So that sounds like an accurate description to me.
So a turkey, you would say a turkey is more described by what it's not than what it is in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, in comparison to what people knew about, right, when the first turkeys arrived, they just sort of put the pieces together of what they did know about.
Right.
We'll just use all these words and put them together. That's what we'll call it. That's funny.
Yeah, so, turkeys, it certainly was that physical appearance that sort of was my first interest. And then, of course, the more I watched them, down at Payne's Prairie, they were used to campers and visitors to the preserve. And so they were pretty watchable until they figured out, well, this guy isn't going away, right? And then I was really impressed by the fact that you could have a flock of turkeys, these big birds, chasing after each other, digging around in the leaf litter. But if they wanted to, they could literally melt right into the woods. They could disappear. And, especially when the leaves are all crunchy and everything, it's impossible to try to keep up with them.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of hooked me too. I was thinking, all right, how am I going to do this? How can I study their behavior if they're only willing, to tolerate observations for a short period of time? So yeah, that's sort of what drew me in. And you guys love turkeys. I've encountered people, the general public, who are fascinated by turkeys. I met this guy from here at a barbecue once, and he was from New York. He was actually a cookbook writer. And when they asked me what I did, I mentioned that I study turkeys, and they became all animated. And he and his friends were talking about how there's a particular field that they drive by in upstate New York where turkeys are always strutting in the spring, and they love to stop and watch them. And the guy said something really funny. He said, "Oh, the social interactions, they were practically like chimpanzees." And I'm not going to give them that level of sort of cognitive ability. It is complex, right? There's a lot going on in a flock of turkeys. And
For sure.
In that sense, for social behavior, right, they're also fascinating.
Yeah.
So how much of your time working with turkeys has been spent watching, wild free ranging birds versus I know that you've also done some in a laboratory setting.
Yeah, so for wild turkeys, many of the questions I wanted to ask for sexual selection required experimental control,
Sure.
right? And so I found out pretty quickly at Payne's Prairie, while I could trap turkeys and mark them and put radio tags on them and collect information on their parasites, um, I really couldn't watch them during the breeding season enough to get an idea of female choice. Part of the issue there was that birds would leave the preserve, and there were literally like hunter tree stands, like just outside the limits of the preserve, And so that's when I decided to try to do some work with captive turkeys. And
Okay.
I don't necessarily recommend that for people that want to do this because it's a huge undertaking to have enough captive turkeys that are truly wild rather than some sort of domesticated version. Um, yeah, it's physically challenging to work with that many animals that are that big. Yeah, but and so that's sort of why I went in that direction. More of my recent work has been in the field on ocellated turkeys in Central
nice.
America. So not wild turkeys.
Okay.
And that's because y'all keep shooting my wild turkeys.
Well, don't blame that on Will.
So you're saying you're willing to take the blame for it, Marcus?
No, I wasn't saying that. I just wanted to jab at you. Well, so I have lots of questions, but one that you brought up already, I have been asked about it, and I've also been perplexed. So I just wanted to start with it, I guess. The drumming behavior that you were describing, that you said there was a fat deposit that was vibrating. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Can you describe to us like what is happening with the bird? Because I get asked that, and I honestly don't. I've heard that. I know what it sounds like. I know I have been with people where it was happening essentially in our back pocket, and they cannot hear it. And I hear the spit, that is associated with it, which audibly I hear from much farther away usually. So I think it'd be interesting for us to understand what that is, and then maybe talk about it as it pertains to the breeding system even.
Yeah, so the drumming sound is from air that's somehow vibrating the trachea. I'm not really sure how that air is moving so that happens. But then the vibrating trachea, right, the breathing tube of the bird, is in turn causing that breast sponge to vibrate. So the sound is coming from the breast sponge, but I'm not really sure how the trachea itself ends up vibrating from that air. I'm not sure that anyone knows, but there are other birds that do it. Even like I mentioned, cranes, right? Cranes certainly have elongated trachea in order to make that sort of long distance call. So turkeys are doing something like that, but I'm not really sure how.
Okay.
So do you think, I've heard the spit, some people think of it, usually when you think of spit, you think of an exhalation that accompanies that, but there are some people who say that they think that the spit is actually the sound of a huge inhalation. Do you know anything about that, or?
No, I have noticed that when turkeys are done strutting, sometimes they do this sort of weird kind of gaping sound, and it almost sounds as though they're getting rid of excess air out of their trachea.
Huh.
But the spit itself, yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, it'd be cool if there were a way. So you'd have to have a turkey in some sort of chamber, breathing air that's maybe marked in some way, right? And you can have some high-speed video showing whether the air is going in or not. Some smoke, not really smoke, but something like that.
Or maybe it's just cold.
Or yeah. Oh, see, now you're thinking. Excellent. Yeah.
No, I spend a lot of my time thinking about this kind of stuff. I'm sure you do as well.
Yeah. Yeah, the sounds are really cool, and for the most part, obviously they're not studied. One of the frustrating things about being a turkey behaviorist is that the vast majority of studies of wild turkeys are what do wild turkeys eat, what eats wild turkeys, right? And then to some degree diseases. And so for the most part, I think behavior has been neglected. As I mentioned, behavior is hard to do in the wild, right? Especially for something that you put a lot of effort into sort of banding or marking individuals only to have a lot of the males harvested. So
even the behavioral work, a lot of that is coming from a GPS transmitter, where we just are getting dots of where they're located, and then maybe we go find a nest and then see where did it nest and what was the fate of the nest.
Yeah,
things like that. But in terms of behavior in terms of their mating interactions, that seems to be a hole.
Yep.
Yeah. So one of the interesting or unique attributes of turkeys that you pointed out earlier was feather iridescence, and I know that you've done a lot of research on feather iridescence, factors that influence it, and how that in turn influences mate choice, right?
So the work that I did with Jeff Hill that you mentioned, that work looks at the effect of parasites on feather iridescence. We don't know whether female turkeys or other male turkeys care about iridescence in their mates or the competitors, right? So that part of the picture we don't know about, and that's partly because turkeys are such big birds that creating a sort of experimental setup where you can sort of give females a choice of two males with different iridescence under controlled lighting conditions is, borderline impossible. And so, the studies that I've done with captive mate choice, females are looking at males outdoors under natural lighting conditions, and the iridescence from the feather depends on the angle of light. It depends on the wavelengths of light that are arriving. So it's a really complicated thing to try to control. And you don't know if you're getting a result. Say you showed preference for a certain male. You don't know if that preference is because of the way the light, during the day was moving through the sky and striking him differently than the other male that the female had a choice of. So
Mm-hmm.
I actually have not figured out a way to test that. Certainly not in the wavelengths that seem to be affected by parasitism. So we showed that males that were infected with coccidia had less iridescence reflection from their feathers in the ultraviolet, so not in the visible colors. And that the more species of coccidia, intestinal parasite, that you gave to the animal, the stronger the reduction in UV would be. And so turkeys can see UV. They sort of see it in a non-traditional way. They don't have a UV receptor. They're capturing ultraviolet light and sort of shifting it over to blue in order to perceive it. So they certainly could potentially be using it in mate choice. We just can't prove that they do, or I haven't been able to prove that they do.
Is there a reasonable alternative hypothesis for why they would be iridescent? I mean, it just seems, I guess, based on other species, it's reasonable that is why they're iridescent, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it might be involved in mate choice. Females might just like shiny males.
Mm-hmm.
That under certain circumstances, that's something that could evolve. And it might be that the iridescence, though, is not the amount of the change in ultraviolet reflectance caused by parasites might not be enough to influence female choice, right? So you can have female choice for indicators of male health or good genes, or you can have female choice just in terms of preferences that they have that we call it the sexy son hypothesis, that by females choosing that, they're choosing males, they're choosing to then get genes that will make their own sons more attractive.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
So it works not by having kids that survive better, it works by having kids that are more attractive.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get my head around that right now.
Yeah, sorry. I've thought about it for a couple decades, so
So you're probably a step or two ahead of the questions that we're about to ask about it. But
I just saw a study actually the other day that iridescent feathers get hotter than non-iridescent feathers. So in the sun, they actually collect heat more. They absorb more heat than other types of feathers. This study was done in sunbirds, I think it was, in Africa. And so another hypothesis possibly for iridescent feathers would be that in terms of signaling or communicating with females, could be that males that have iridescent feathers have shown that they can survive despite actually absorbing more heat from their environment, right? That they're basically handicapping themselves and through that ability. It's an idea.
I like the idea. I'm kind of blown away. I was trying to think of alternative hypotheses earlier, which is why I asked you that, and I had none. So,
luckily, I just read about that today. So,
yeah, I'm gonna. Oh gosh, what are some? Do you know of any other traits that we can think of in other species that a maladaptive trait is like a signal of fitness? I mean, the peacock tail example you gave earlier.
Peacock tail. There's the tail itself. Dragging that thing around, I think is potentially a handicap. we know that females are choosing in peacocks, at least in some populations, based on the number of eyes on the tail.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have to ask the question about the tail itself, right? You would think there could be an easier way to show eyes on your tail than the huge tail that they carry. So people have pointed to that as a handicap. There's an African bird called a wida, which is just sort of a big finch-sized thing, and its tail is, I don't know, 6-7 times longer than the bird itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so people have argued that is a handicap.
What bird species was that? We'll cut it into the YouTube.
Whydah, Whydah, I think.
Okay.
It's an African bird.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, I guess when I'm thinking through that as well, it is a handicap, but it may not have a great fitness consequence under some conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just thinking about my really crude understanding of runaway selection, where you're in a predator-free environment, you get more and more elaborate because there's not a great cost,
right?
Compared to the potential gains, I guess. Is that playing into this equation?
So if your handicap allows, so there's a number of questions, right? A handicap can be costly in terms of what you have to invest to grow it or produce it, or it can be costly in terms of the risk it puts you at, as you mentioned, for predation. Right? So I guess there's a number of ways something can be a handicap.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, for my master's, I studied curassows, which are sort of like turkey-like birds in some ways.
Yeah, really cool looking creature.
Central America, and actually that study was done in South America. But so as a master's student, I gave my first presentation at an ornithology meeting, and the bird I studied had this big fleshy knob on top of its bill. And there was a guy in the back of the room at the end of my talk who had a question, and he said, well, isn't your study of this knobbed bird evidence of the handicap principle? And this was an idea that an Israeli scientist had put forth about handicaps in sexual selection. And my answer, being the naive master student I was no, because nobody believes that anymore. And the guy who asked the question was the guy who originated the hypothesis, Amos Zahavi. And when I gave my answer, there was this like rumble that went through the audience. And I went and sat down. And I was like, oh, that was kind of weird. And the moderator said, do you know who that was? I later apologized. I went up to him and he said, no. He said, you will send me a photograph of your bird and I will use it as evidence. So he was not bothered at all.
That's funny.
But I think naked heads on turkeys potentially could be a handicap. You've probably seen how strutting males sometimes have to deal with biting flies or mosquitoes, right? They have to actually interrupt their display, and sometimes they're rubbing their head against their back. If females prefer these naked head and fleshy ornaments on the head of males, a male has to be able to sacrifice some blood, run the risk of catching turkey malaria. I think on turkeys, you can have these sort of ornaments serving in mate choice in more than one way. Right? They can be health indicators. They can be handicaps. So I think there's nothing wrong with saying that those structures can have multiple purposes.
Yeah.
And then I was reading one of your papers this morning, and it seems like, you were talking just a minute ago about how the iridescence may contribute to, birds being, warmer, potentially hyperthermic. Maybe that's a consequence. But then you also published a paper that said that the naked head may help reduce that body heat. Is that right?
Yeah. So I was able to show experimentally that if you re-insulated their heads, basically if you I used socks from Walmart. Um, if you insulated their heads to the same degree that feathers would, right? If their
Uh-huh.
heads were feathered, um, then it actually doesn't help them much at cold temperatures, which was contrary to my idea.
Yeah.
Um, but at high temperatures, and in that study, high was 32 Celsius, which is like mid 90s. Um, uh, so in that case, it didn't take long. It took like an hour and a half, 2 hours for the smallest males to reach critical body temperatures. Right, I had to
Mm,
end the experiment, right, because their temperature was getting too high.
mm,
So yeah, I think this idea of um, these different trade-offs, right? You're a big bird. You're probably evolving to be bigger to combat other males, right? To be more successful in keeping males away from females. Well, once you get bigger, you run into the problem of overheating more easily, right? If you're going to be strutting around, you're going to be fighting, and you have a lot of body mass, it's hard to dump that body heat. And
Well, and potentially you have the added problem of iridescence concentrating heat.
yeah, right. I mean, it's just the new idea of that actually making it worse that I think is pretty exciting.
Yeah.
And one of my papers argued that one reason that female turkeys might one reason they do store sperm might be um, so that they can mate during times of the year when males can actually display. Right, so like in South Texas, when the temperatures that are suitable, conditions that are suitable for a hen to raise a brood occur later in the year, then males actually start strutting. All right. And so one of the questions about that mismatch is why would males start strutting so much earlier than females will start nesting? And one hypothesis about that is that it's just too hot later for males, right? So females can mate early, store sperm, and then start a nest later when conditions are good for raising poults. Um, yeah, so I think all of these sort of parts of the picture of reproductive behavior, reproductive physiology, at some point they all start to intersect.
So I have a couple of questions that I don't even know where to go with this. One thing that came to mind for me, I was thinking about like a biogeographical gradient. Do you have, or do you know, do males tend to have more feathered heads as you go toward the poles?
Mm,
Or I know there seems to be a body size gradient that's, as you get
mm,
closer to the equator, they tend to be smaller.
yeah, it's hard to know because since we almost lost turkeys, right? Since they were, I mean, honestly, they were gone from what, like 40, 50% of their range by World
Right.
War II, right?
Yeah.
And where they did occur, they were deep in swamps, right? There weren't that
mm,
many of them left. And so then when we went to restore turkeys, right, we mixed everything up, right? We would have sort of disrupted that geographical pattern. So, and I think there are not that many museum specimens either that where you could go back and look at that.
Hmm.
Turkeys are so big um, that museums typically didn't keep many of them.
mm.
Um, so maybe in Europe, I mean, maybe early on a lot were sent back to Europe. I'm not sure,
Hmm.
uh, but I think it is a good question.
So the other question that, based on what you were telling us a few minutes ago with the sperm storage, how much of a gap is there, like from the strutting to the nesting? Like how long would they be storing sperm?
So in South Texas, if I remember correctly, it was like a month and a half, 2 months. Um, and the record of sperm storage comes from studies of domestic turkeys, and they still had some turkeys that would lay a fertile egg. I think it was 5 months.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
5 months.
And in the female reproductive tract, or
I
these,
thought it was limited to about a month.
Yeah, that's
well, yeah, they weren't producing all fertile eggs, right? They
Yeah.
were producing an occasional fertile egg in that work. But inside of the female oviduct are these sperm storage crypts, and so the sperm just blindly kind of swim in there, and then it closes behind them, and then the surrounding cells feed the sperm. They give it nutrition
what?
to keep it alive.
Oh my God. Are
Yeah.
you serious?
And at some point later on, somehow the female is able to eject those sperm back into the oviduct.
So it's like a sperm hatchery, basically. Like they just
Yeah, it's like a nursery, right? For
yeah.
sort of keeping them going. Yeah.
Wow.
And we know relatively little about it, and most of what we know, of course, comes from domestic turkeys.
Right.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would guess it would be less than optimal to have a hen trying to fertilize her clutch with sperm that were a month or older.
Right.
But it's possible.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like it may even be commonplace potentially in some places, like you're saying from South Texas. I guess if um, well, I'm thinking of when you get toward the edge of the range, I guess the thermal limits of the species, you might be forced into a situation where
Hmm.
the sperm has to be stored for longer periods of time.
Yeah. If most of what we know comes from domestic turkeys, and domestic turkeys are domesticated from South Mexican wild turkeys, a subspecies that doesn't occur anymore. The question is what I've told you about sperm storage even relevant for most of the rest of the range, right? Is it relevant for other subspecies? Well, we know from that one study from South Texas where they basically looked at a gradient, actually north-south in Texas, and they shot a bunch of hens and then looked to see if they were storing sperm or not, and whether males were producing sperm or not.
Mm-hmm.
That's how they were able to figure out that pattern. That was a state wildlife agency report. It wasn't like a peer-reviewed publication.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the one. It was in the early 90s.
Yeah. So I think there are still a lot of interesting questions to be asked about. What's in a male's interest? What's in a female's interest? And I think in terms of mate choice, you may have a male that's sort of trying to keep other males away from a female or a small flock of females, but that doesn't mean that she wants that male, right? I mean, often I think it's especially common in sort of wildlife management circles to sort of believe that a dominant male is the females just sort of agree to it, right?
Right.
But I've certainly seen this, and I've heard it from other people that females don't always answer a gobble, right?
Right.
They may hear some guy gobbling, but if they don't respond, he doesn't know where they are.
Right.
And so some people have argued that females are, in fact, sort of leaving a flock, visiting other males, coming back again, right? So that'd be another reason to store sperm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean that seems like it would be especially true with some of the work that I'm sure you're familiar with. It was published out of California just a little while back, where I think it was somewhere around a third of clutches had multiple paternity.
Yeah. Yeah, that's Alan Krakauer's work.
Yep,
Yeah, it's really, really
exactly.
interesting stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So I really want to stay on this, and this is all kind of like revolutionary to my thinking about the turkey mating system. But and of course we're staying on that same general topic, but we haven't even talked about snoods yet. And I know that you've spent a lot of time studying snoods. Dr. Hill brought up that physical attribute as well. So can you tell us a little bit about that work that you've been
Well,
involved
but
in?
first I'm going to test you.
Okay.
Okay, so what is the scientific name for a snood?
Marcus, I think he's asking you.
I would have said snood.
We have to.
Frontal process.
The frontal process.
Yeah, snood is much better, right?
Yeah, I mean, that seems like it could be anything that sticks off the front of an animal.
We'll leave it at
Well,
that.
and I've read that, and I didn't know that was specific to the snood.
Frontal. Yes. Yeah, I think the two turkey species, like wild turkeys, ocellated turkeys, both have snoods. And then I think it's maybe bellbirds from South America. There's even one that has like 3, although they call it the 3-wattled bellbird. They're considered snoods. Yeah, I think that's it in the world.
Wow.
The frontal process.
Frontal process.
Got it.
Okay, there'll be a quiz later.
Yeah, I will never miss that one again.
Good. Yeah, so snoods. Okay, so the big challenge with studying the function of the snood is the fact that they can retract it and relax it.
Yeah.
So I think what intrigues people about my work on the snoods was that I just made up a way to try to measure it consistently. And that was I used a little spring scale that I clipped to the tip of the snood, and then I pulled it out till the scale said, I don't know, it was 20 or 30 grams on the scale. And I just did that to every turkey. Right? Because what are you going to do? I mean, otherwise you're like pulling it to its maximum length, but that's not, that's sort of arbitrary in some ways, right?
Yeah.
Right.
The snood length, the snood length under a given pressure.
Exactly. And I don't know how many times you're just about at the right sort of structurally length, and he shakes his head and the scale goes flying. Yeah. So,
well, after I read some of your work, we were catching gobblers down in the Osceola Range down in South Florida, and I told the students, I was like, we have to measure the snood length on the gobblers. And then we were like, okay, how do we do that? I told them I would ask you, so I'm glad we got to it.
Now you know. Yeah.
Looks like you're buying a spring scale, Marcus.
Yeah, well, I didn't know.
Yeah, so I mean, when you're handling them, they're right. Usually, the snood is retracted, right?
Yeah,
short, and so that's pretty straightforward to measure. But that stretch snood length. I tried doing it from like photographs during displays, but you would need some sort of side standard, right, to compare it to.
Yeah, like the eye or something that's pretty standard across individuals.
Yeah.
Scale.
I'd wish you told me that 30 years ago. Then it would have made my life easier. But,
the eye?
Yeah, as a sort of way to standardize those photos. But so I just came up with using the Buccholz scale, and so that's what I've used ever since, just to be consistent. Mm-hmm. It gets tricky though. So I've collected measurements from hunter-killed birds, right? And so those snoods are not retracted. They're just sort of laid out there and relaxed. And so it's not clear then how to compare that to other types of measurements.
Right.
And so that's always been sort of a problem. I've never had, relaxed, artificially sort of stretched with a scale, and then had the same individuals dead, right? But that's what you would need to sort of relate all 3 of those measurements.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we were, just because as an interesting aside, I've got an ongoing project right now where we're looking at fertility indices in hunter-harvested birds. So we're working with histopathologists to section the testes after harvest and, coming up with an index that way by looking at the seminiferous tubules and the spermatozoa and everything like that. And that is one of the measurements that we collected to associate or correlate with that was snood length. And we didn't see a strong relationship between the snood length of a dead bird and that fertility index that we came up with.
Yeah, we've looked a little bit at sort of the endocrine basis for snood length, and it's clearly not simple. It's really complex.
Yeah,
It looks
right.
like stress hormones are somehow interacting
Yeah.
with that. So some of the captive birds, we've measured them sort of during their development, and then tried to correlate snood length and snood growth with hormone levels. And of course, hormones, it's always a snapshot, right? So, like, it could be a bad day or a good day. But yeah, the patterns that sort of nothing jumped out as sort of a clear cut pattern that was true of every individual.
Sure.
So, with the work on snoods, essentially, well, maybe you could just tell us, like, what role was that playing in the selection as you measured it?
Yeah, as far as I can tell, it's the number one thing that the females are paying attention to. And so through choice trials where I gave females a choice between two males, live males displaying, or 16 males at once, or decoys that were given little fake latex snoods, right? Females are almost always picking males with longer snoods. So it seems to be, and in the studies that I did at University of Florida, the differences between males was just a couple millimeters, but nothing else explained the female behavior except for that measurement.
God, I wonder how they were even able to detect that difference when the birds are moving around and there's some distance between them. I mean, that's a very precise measurement.
Right, and so that would have been that sort of the measurements that I took of the male when he was not displaying, right? So
Yeah.
what that looked like when she was looking at him, I can't really say, right? And what I was able to measure, yeah, they were really minor differences. So yeah, females do seem to care about that. And I know from my studies in Florida and then experimental studies we've done here that males with males of the same age, in which one has more parasites than the other, specifically coccidia, the more parasitized male will have shorter snoods, a shorter snood. Yeah. And so it's an interesting question, and this is one of the reasons we looked at hormones, because why would having parasites result in you growing a shorter snood? Like, what's the cost of adding a couple millimeters to your snood length? You wouldn't, right? It's just a fleshy structure.
Yeah.
Why? How could parasites influence that? And I don't know the answer.
Okay. Well, have you looked into whether snood length is correlated with any other indicators of fitness?
Well, older males typically have longer snoods.
Okay.
Right. So I don't know what the sort of top end of that is. Right. So after, say, 3 or 4 years, does the snood continue to grow? I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
But certainly if you age males by beard length and spur length and then correlate that age to snood length, certainly older males have longer snoods. So that could be another reason, right, that females choose longer snoods, right? It might be that when I give them a choice of two males that are the same age, maybe they're actually looking for the older male, even though that's not being presented to them.
Right.
So,
that makes sense.
Yeah, that would be interesting to give them known aged males that have the same size snood and see as they're still.
Yeah.
Essentially, the selection should be neutral if it's about the snood, right?
Or do you say, all right, I don't have a choice here in snood, so I'm going to go with iridescence, right? Or beard length. I was really disappointed. Beard length has never come out to be significant in any of the mate choice or male-male competition trials I've done. It's never.
Well, that one's like the easy one to manipulate. You just snip it off.
Yeah, right. Easy to measure. Yeah.
See, Marcus, you can go ahead and trim your beard, and you won't have any fitness consequences.
Here we go. Oh, yeah, tell that to my wife. She does not like the shaved look on me. So, with the other traits, so you just mentioned the beard. What about spur length?
Um, yeah, so not in my study. Spur length has never been important, and spur length has not correlated with parasite load ever.
Okay.
Mm.
But the thing about snood length that also has turned out to be important is that I've shown um, that there are specific genes in the immune system. It's the same set of genes that are involved in organ transplants. When you have to find a match for a kidney or something,
Mhm.
that same set of genes, they're called the MHC, or major histocompatibility genes. Um, in turkeys, males with longer snoods um, typically have certain genes, certain genetic sequences at those MHC loci. And so that sort of fits in with my idea that females are looking for long snooded males in order to get good genes so that their poults are less likely to suffer from parasitism. Basically, they have immune protection as a result of their mom's choice of a father for them. And so that's been my sort of good genes working
Wow.
hypothesis for a long time.
So, do you think it's fair to say that if you were in a population that had a greater rate of, parasite prevalence for some factor, that could be potentially confusing the hen's mate selection process? Like, could it lead to that shorter snood length and interfere with her ability to choose the best male?
Hmm.
Or would it still be the best male would still have the longer snood in spite of the infection?
I,
I know
I,
we're going way out on a limb here, but this is fascinating to me.
yeah, I think it'll
And
again.
I think Marcus knows why I'm asking it.
Yeah.
It'll depend on the mechanism, I think, right? What we don't know, even in that scenario, is okay, if you got more parasites, right? w- Why do you grow a shorter snoot,
Mhm.
right? We know it's correlated uh, with not having certain good genes. But what's the connection? Why can't they cheat, right? If I've got parasites, why don't I say, well, um, and ladies, I don't have parasites. I just want to make that clear. Right? Imagine I'm a turkey. Why can't I say, you know what? I've got these calories here. I could either grow a spur longer or I could grow a snood longer. Like, why not just grow the snood longer? Because that's important to females in
Mhm.
their
Mhm.
choice. Um, so the way this gets back to your question, Will, is that are snoods an indicator specifically of parasite load, or are they an indicator of condition? Right? So parasite affects condition, condition
Sure,
affects snood length.
sure.
Uh, we don't know that.
Yeah.
I have another question related to that, and I think we should just dive right on into why Will was
Yeah.
asking. But, uh, so when you infected turkeys with coccidia, we just talked about the snood, the shorter of infected ones. And then, as far as I understand, the same thing is true with the iridescence. That's really suppressed. I don't know what the right term is for what you measured, but they're less iridescent.
Yeah.
So in a turkey outside of that infection causing this clear break in that, would those two traits be positively correlated? Do you know, like the how iridescent one is? Does that correlate with how its relative snood length is, aside from the parasite status?
Well, why have I never done that? Yeah, that's a really good idea. I have those data. Why have I never actually looked at that?
Mm,
Right? Yeah.
I was just curious.
So let's stop this. Call me back next week. Answer that
We
question.
can cut it in. That's no problem.
Yeah.
Or we'll have you back. I mean, our audience is going to love what you have to offer.
So for the iridescent feathers, one thing that Jeff Hill's group at Auburn was able to do is they were able to actually use electron microscopy and slice through the feathers and look at the color producing structure on it. And we're able to demonstrate, and this it's actually not published in the paper, but it shows up sort of in a book chapter that Matt Shockey, one of Jeff's grad students, published. And it's the thickness of the protein layer, the cuticle, on the barb of the feather that is thinner on infected males. And that then is what causes the light that's iridescing out of the feather to not be as bright in the UV. So like in that case, we actually know the mechanism, right? In the sense that if you've got more parasites, you're probably producing more antibodies to fight the parasites. Antibodies are made of proteins. Then you don't have proteins to lay down on your feathers. Right? I think that's a reasonable connection.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have that to understand the effect on snoods.
Yeah.
Yes, I guess it's kind of like fat in the sense that fat is mobilized when animals are starving from different portions, like, the order that it goes in, the sub-Q fat versus the visceral fat. So in this case, they'd be sacrificing, adding those proteins to the cuticles, and allocating them elsewhere, like to antibodies. Okay.
Yeah, you'd rather try to prevent more damage internally, especially coccidia it's poking holes in your intestine, basically, right? And that prevents you from absorbing nutrients. So you sort of want to suppress that as being more important than the color of your feathers.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So under really controlled conditions, what will happen to snood, iridescence, or any of these other structures in terms of, are they separate signals? Do they tell females different things about males? Or are they sort of backup signals, right? So, okay, he grew a long snood. He better also have nicely UV iridescent feathers, right? Are they sort of insurance that a female is looking for, that a male isn't cheating in what he's displaying?
Mm-hmm.
I think those are really interesting questions.
Yeah, I agree. So, Rich, let me think about how to set this up. When Will was asking earlier, there was a study recently looking at coccidia loading, environmental loading near feeding stations.
Ooh,
so basically a feeder. It was in Mississippi. I was a part of the bigger project, but not the specific publications. But I believe they found somewhere between 3 or 5 times the coccidia load near the feeding station as they did elsewhere in the environment.
Yeah.
And that got me concerned from a conservation standpoint about feeding, because it's become prevalent across the Southeast, where easterns are appearing to decline, and that's been relatively recent. And I started looking into coccidia specifically, and then found some of the European work with red grouse, I think, showing population cycling being correlated with prevalence of coccidia infections or something along those lines. And then that's where I studied, or when I was doing that work, trying to understand that, the implications, I stumbled across the publication that you had co-authored, where you experimentally infected turkeys. So I guess is that a good way to kind of couch, Will, why you came with that question a few minutes ago? Like, if we're doing something in an environment that is artificially elevating the parasite infection rate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How might that affect the species?
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty much what I was thinking because I was involved somewhat tangentially. This is definitely way outside of my area of expertise, but some work on mate selection in white-tailed deer, and I know that MHC genes play a significant role in that. It seems like that is conserved across a lot of species. That selection for that MHC, those MHC loci. But it made me think, if that's the case with turkeys, when you brought that up, and if this practice is widespread, leading to widespread parasite infection or parasite, loading in these birds, and it's affecting their secondary sexual characteristics, is that in turn, are we having this widespread effect on the population where we're interfering with mate selection, mate choice, by you know decreasing the iridescence of the feathers or maybe shortening the snood length? Does
Yeah.
that interfere with the hen's ability to do what they've been doing for
Yeah, I mean,
thousands of years?
what if all the males have short snoods and are not very iridescent because they all are eating of feeders that are contaminated with this parasite?
Yeah,
That's
well,
a much easier way to say it, Marcus.
there's the desert island theory, right? If you're the last two people on an island, love finds a way. So
Yeah.
I think animals are, there are mating preferences. And if animals can't sort of achieve their preferences, then the backup plan is to mate with whoever. And so I wouldn't be concerned per se that it would be harming turkey populations unless hens are delaying choice, right? If they keep looking for males with a snood longer than some sort of threshold value, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those are not in the population because coccidia has really impacted them. Then if females sort of are waiting longer and take longer to nest, right, then you could run into sort of ecological problems, I think, with brood rearing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know of any study that shows that in turkeys or in birds, but there was a study done in Sweden where um, they were hunting moose, and they found that it was selective hunting. And so when they hunted out the males with the largest antlers, cow moose still looked for those males. And as a result, because they were only fertile once a month, they their calves were less body weight by the time winter came along. And so if there's some equivalent in turkeys where females are delaying mating for that reason, then maybe there could be a consequence then of poults not being hatched at the time of year when there's a lot of food out there or fewer predators or something along that line. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question.
Yeah, I guess the other, I was thinking through of another way, and you can tell me where I'm wrong on this because I'm sure I will be. Would it, in the coccidia example, if all the males are, or maybe the most dominant males can secure that feeding opportunity and defend it, so then it sort of becomes this equalizer where now you don't have much variation in snood length. Could there then be a weaker selection for that, that gene that would confer protection, I guess, to the poults as you're, based on the hypothesis you presented earlier, some sort of mechanism like that?
Yeah, so you in that scenario, right, you wouldn't have female selection necessarily for parasite resistance genes, but it would still be female choice for good genes, right? Because that guy found a way to make it work, right? Maybe he had lots of parasites, but he was able to secure food to sort of compensate for for any damage that that parasite load caused to his body condition, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think it can. The system can be really flexible if the snood is a condition indicator, right?
Mm-hmm.
If that's the mechanism, if the truthfulness of the snood is a truthful indicator of the overall health of the male, not just coccidia, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the case, then it's a really flexible way for females to make sure that they get the best male under any one geographic or ecological condition.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
I know that you said earlier the snood length seems to be the most important trait. Are there other important traits that we have not gone into that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, so in those studies, snood length is often tightly correlated with the skull cap, the width of that bluish white area on top of their head.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Usually there's sort of a seam in the middle and it has kind of two halves to it. And on males that have really extensive skull caps, they almost sort of hang over the eye, right? Especially when he's displaying. It's almost like a eyebrow kind of hanging over.
Yeah.
And so males with long snoods tend to have those wider skull caps. Not every male. And so there's at least a possibility that females are assessing that as well.
Have you done anything to manipulate the coloration of, like,
I would love to. I would love to. And my current idea, and you guys are welcome to do this if you want to steal my idea.
I don't think that I have the capability of doing
No.
whatever you're going to say.
Yeah, I think the answer is turkey TV. I think putting up LED monitors in the field, right? So you can manipulate the color most easily on a video, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than try to do it on a live turkey.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some really interesting things. I'm particularly interested in. Some males go completely white. Have you ever seen that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring this up. I'm glad you went there.
Yeah, there's definitely variation in this.
So I'm really curious about that, right? So if you know, well, first of all, why be red, right? And we know that red is that's blood, that's hemoglobin, right? That's flowing through the caruncles. The blue is arrangement of collagen molecules, and they can sort of cover that blue up, or they can reveal that blue. And then I always told everybody it was melanin, but then someone actually studied it. It's collagen. And
I'm just fascinated right now.
Yeah, I didn't know that this was a thing. So
going completely white, right? So that would mean you'd need to drain all the blood from that. And then you'd have to sort of cover up or hide or arrange those collagens so they don't look blue. Yeah, and that's a real mystery. Like, why would you do that? Do females care? Right? They might not even care. And if they do care, why do they care? And this might get back to the handicapping idea, right? If the head is serving to dump body heat, then you've got to pass blood through those structures, right, to dissipate that heat, to deliver that heat to the surface of the bird. And maybe cutting off that blood supply and showing that you can strut despite not being able to dump body heat, you know, maybe that's meaningful in terms of a survival handicap that females might find important, right? I'm not sure why, but that's one idea I've had. So imagine you can have these TVs set up in places that hen turkeys visit, right? And you can have speakers and stuff to play strutting sounds. And then you can sort of see, do they like the TV monitor with the white fleshy structured guy, or this sort of more typical red coloration? It's so unpredictable in turkeys when you're watching them that I don't know even in captivity how you would manipulate it. So that's why I think the video idea is the best way to do it.
Yeah, we almost need to watch this play out in mating systems many times over and sort of get a process in a natural setting.
Yeah.
See, is there variation that seems to explain selection, and then manipulate the trait that seems to be driving it.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the TV monitor idea. That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what was really interesting to me is shout out to Zach Conlon if you're listening. I think he is one of our occasional listeners, but he was telling me a story a couple of weekends ago about this hunt that he had recently in Tennessee, and I think it was a group of 3 or 4 total males. And long story short, like all these males come out, one of the males kind of goes into the center of this display area, and his head is very clearly just bright blue and white.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other males, and he's not gobbling, but the other males kind of fan out around him.
Mm.
They're all strutting, and the other males' heads are predominantly red.
Mm.
And these were all adult males, at least 2 years old or older birds.
Yeah.
And it was almost like all 3 of those, satellite males or whatever you call them, they had the red head coloration, whereas his was more blue white tones, and he didn't gobble. He just let these other males just kind of
Wow.
hang out around him. Like, I don't know if it was adding to his courtship display to have those other males there, and it was some aspect of kinship selection or
Right.
something along those lines. But that was the first time I've heard all those concepts discussed before, but never as it pertains to head coloration, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really cool. I mean, so that's what we have are all these sort of anecdotal observations, things I've seen, right? Turkey
Yeah.
hunters have seen. In the past, I spent way too much time Googling wild turkey images to see like how many white, right? Because everyone wants that sort of Thanksgiving image of the bright caruncles.
Yeah.
For a long time, it was really hard to find any of them with their white caruncles instead of red. But yeah, so accumulating those sort of stories in order to come up with hypotheses that are worth testing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right now, I mean, how much is a big screen TV these days? It's not that expensive, right?
Right.
If it rains on it in the woods, it's okay. But sort of for a real comprehensive study, trying to understand what we would call the functional significance of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it advantageous to the male? Do females care? Do other males care? Right? Would be quite an undertaking. But yeah, maybe before I retire, we'll see. Maybe after I retire, it might be actually a better time to do it.
Yeah. You can't turn away from the turkeys, that's for sure.
So we haven't talked about male-male competition, and
Yeah.
I've done similar studies quite a long time ago of where I actually set males against each other to see which of their characteristics predicted who would win the dominance interaction. And I also had them interact with decoys where I varied the snood length and the caruncle number. And it's exactly as we saw in females, that typically longer snooded males will win a contest. And if you put a decoy in there with a long snood and one with a short snood, and you put a pile of seed in front of it, in almost every case, the turkey that's introduced to that sort of testing arena will go and grab the seed from the shorter snooded male. Yeah.
That is awesome.
It's totally consistent with
still in the Wheaties of the short snood.
Somehow that snood is communicating something important about the benefit of mating that male and the potential cost of fighting with that male.
Yeah, that is crazy. It's all about the snood.
hate to say it, but it's true.
What we've been saying is more snoods, more broods.
Longer the snood, bigger the brood. The gobbling. Have you done anything with gobbling? I mean, they obviously there's a lot of variation across individuals, presumably. And do longer snooded individuals gobble more or less? Or I just find that really interesting because it seems it's another distinct characteristic of the breeding system.
Yeah, so I've never found gobbling to correlate with anything. It's never showed up. The frequency of gobbling, how often they gobble per unit time, has never been correlated with mate choice, outcomes of male contests.
We haven't seen an association with fertility either.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I don't think females, at least in captivity, females don't seem to like gobbling up close. So, like if a female is inspecting a male and he's strutting, if he gobbles, the sort of my casual observations are she's more likely than to go on to another male. So if the gobbling is interrupting the strut, that seems to be something they don't like. And I've never actually sort of collected that on that sort of micro scale of that stimulus response. But yeah, I think gobbling is a long distance type of communication. Just about, where are you?
Locator,
Yeah, I think that's primarily what that's for. It may be important also for males, right, to assess where other males are.
Yeah.
But
I wonder about other characteristics. People have asked me about this before, and sometimes you're in the woods and one gobbles and it just like shatters the earth. It's just long and deep and just in your face. And then you have other ones where they're just, I don't know. You can like Will, the gobbler that we were on. We all three of the people involved in this hunt, we had been hearing this individual gobbling over and over. And then one of the gobbles, it was like his demeanor changed. And then we knew he was coming, all three of us. You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Like we heard his voice change. And I hear people talk about stuff like that. So it makes me wonder, is there anything being communicated in the song?
Yeah.
Maybe it's not about frequency, but other structural characteristics about, how long it is or how deep the voice is or other characteristics. I'm having trouble describing the sound characteristics, but I just wonder if there are other things. I could see one with longer snood having a deeper voice because he's more able to do that or something. I don't know. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on some of those other aspects.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the challenge is always how do you collect the data to look at that, right? And I think that gets back to the sort of strutting sound too. Because measuring those things are tricky because it all depends on when you're measuring it. Where is your microphone relative to the orientation of the bird? What are the environmental conditions? I'm sure you've heard or seen, in a clear morning versus a foggy morning, things can sound really different.
Yeah.
And leaf off versus leaf on, all that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's what makes those kind of things so hard to study.
I was just thinking, let's put a microphone in front of a gobbler with a long snood and one with a short snood, let them gobble into it, and then we'll go play that to females and see if she goes to one.
Yeah, you can do it. There'll be a sample size of 2, but okay.
And we'd replicate,
I don't know what kind of
maybe a longer gradient even.
Yeah, yeah, certainly. But honestly, part of the problem I think is that getting resources to do those sort of studies is difficult. Right? And I was lucky in the times that I've done this work. Animal behaviorists thought the work was very interesting, right? But I can tell you early on, everyone kept telling me, well, why don't you get funding from the National Wild Turkey Federation, right, or something like that? But of course, all of the turkey organizations are about managing the wild resource and increasing population size, and so typically don't fund basic biology studies,
Right.
and so I think now actually it would be particularly difficult, right, to get resources to do that kind of study. But yeah, I certainly think it'd be worth doing, with enough sort of studies, both management oriented and basic biology, right? We really build this picture of the entire natural history of this species.
Yeah.
I think that's, and given that so many people are interested in turkeys, whether they hunt or not, right, that it'd be really nice to answer all these questions.
Well, management always, stems from having a sound and thorough understanding of the natural history of a species, the life history of a species. So
Well, I think
that's the
they
foundation.
Yeah, like if you start to understand what is affecting the mating system, which presumably has some sort of fitness outcome, that is an important information, even critical to managing or conserving the species, and understanding what actions on the landscape, how they might influence
Sure.
the conservation of the species. So I definitely think they intersect, and we need to do more of that. That intersection to really fully understand the biology of it, what it means to our understanding of biology and ecology, but also how we can utilize that to make smart decisions about the conservation of the species as well.
Many of the studies I've done have been captive studies, and you can argue that that's a really unnatural situation. But what I think it reveals is, if given a choice, females do have a preference, right? And that's shown, that is true. So then the question is, in the wild, given all the things that a hen has to worry about, right? Does preference for snoods reach the sort of same level of importance, right, during mate choice? Because in the wild, she has to worry about predator risks, right? I mentioned time in the season can be important. So while I'm definitely out of the captive turkey business, I, I think that set the stage for some studies that can still be done with wild turkeys that are going to be relevant to this sort of basic question about mate choice. And you mentioned technology. I think like the tracking studies, more and more the ability of telemetry to monitor, who the turkeys are with, right? If you can get out there and get tags on everybody, the tags are communicating, right?
Yeah.
Saying this gobbler was this hen and then was with that hen. And then, this hen left her flock and maybe went over and visited this other guy, right? I mean, the potential really is there. I love to watch the birds as an animal behaviorist, right? But I understand that technology can begin to give us answers that we would never be able to observe.
The other interesting thing is, we were talking a minute ago about the female mate choice, and I wonder with like the behavioral dominance that we see among males, like I wonder how in the wild, how often she actually gets to choose versus having that choice made for her by that particular male that's securing most of the breeding opportunities, being dominant over her other options.
Yeah.
That really intrigues me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And then if you throw in the sperm storage idea, it really makes it much more complex.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Especially if that's going out months. I mean,
yeah.
How many opportunities could she take advantage of over a month,
Right. So you need the DNA fingerprinting, right? You need basically genetic patterns of all the possible males out there. Her DNA, and then the DNA from the poults, which I think these days you could probably get it from the egg membranes. If you go collect shells
Yeah.
after the poults hatch, I think you can get DNA from that.
Yeah, there's some folks that are doing that now.
So, yeah, get busy, gentlemen. There's a lot to do.
There is a lot to do.
Yeah, we've been working on it for sure. But every time I think of, contemplate this, I think, man, there's just so much to do. We've got so far to go. There's a lot of really awesome work that's been done, and we still have a long way to go. A lot to learn.
These days, I'm not doing too much with turkey behavior. I've been looking at LPDV, the virus, and seeing if there's any chance that affects iridescence of feathers. And so every year we're working with turkey hunters to collect samples.
Nice.
And hopefully, I'm hoping a paper, at least the data for that paper will be done this year. And that's a project where I've relied a lot on undergraduate research help. It's great experience for students to come in the lab, right? Learn how to isolate DNA. And I am I'm an animal behaviorist by training. And so I know how to do some molecular genetics in the lab. But if something goes wrong, luckily I'm in a biology department and I can run around and find somebody who actually knows what they're doing.
I'm the same way. If you print me out the instructions, I'm good. But
yeah,
Put one drop into here.
Exactly.
Yeah. But making a recipe correctly does not a chef make, right?
No. When things don't work, it's like, okay, I'll do it again, right? And it still doesn't work. Then you go and find help. And what comforts me is often my genetics colleagues say, sometimes this just happens, order all new reagents, clean your lab, and hopefully next week it'll start working again. And honestly, that happens sometimes. So is it science or art? Sometimes it's hard to tell. But yeah, so we've been sampling for LPDV, and I'd like to see, well, first of all, I want to see if it's correlated with body condition, but also whether that's affecting iridescence. So we've got students measuring that in the lab. And I think we've got samples now since 2014. So we've got quite a few.
Wow.
And
is there any, I guess you said you were out of the captive turkey business, but I just thought I'd ask the experimental infection with LPDV and whether or not that affects snood length. Is that in the cards?
Yeah, well, we don't even really know how LPDV is transmitted. I've been digging into that literature, and it's no one's actually confirmed that. So I know for the most part, people aren't worried about it anymore, right? Because it's turning up in 40 to 50% of the gobblers sampled. But I still think it's an immunosuppressive virus. So I think maybe the effects are not catastrophic. They don't drop dead, but there are effects on condition and lifetime fitness. So that's why I've been sort of playing around with it to see.
Yeah, we're collecting some data on that in Alabama too right now.
Oh, good.
We're collecting it on all of our captured individuals in Florida.
All right, pluck some feathers, guys.
Well, now I know. I was sitting there as you were going through that and thinking, man, I wish we had feathers from those birds.
Yeah, we could have provided a lot.
But we do have some other morphological data and behavioral data on each of them as well.
Yeah. So I've been playing around with that a little bit. I've got, honestly, I've got tons of data that I haven't published from previous studies. I'd like to do that. We've done some work with looking at the side that a male struts from. You know how if a female passes by, he sort of orients the tail.
Yeah.
Way. So in captivity, at least in cages and mate choice, we have video of everything, right? So we're able to document whether males tend to be left or right-sided in their strutting displays.
Another
So
thing I never would have thought of.
And guess what the girls like?
Right-sided males.
They like males that are consistent. So you can be a lefty or a righty, but don't switch back and forth.
Interesting.
I can appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. So that needs publishing. So
does the snood, is that the same pattern there? Like if it's hanging over the right or the left?
Oh, wow. I better start taking notes.
Well, every time he gobbles, it's going to get all mixed
you better
up.
be consistent, though. I mean,
maybe it favors. Maybe it does have a tendency to hang to one side more than the other.
Yeah, I'm going to let you publish that paper.
I just think like my brain fills with ideas.
Sure. There's a lot of really good questions.
Yeah.
We're also we did my colleague actually in the Department of Biology, Rebecca Kimball, at your school, and Brant Faircloth, who's at LSU. We did a large DNA sequencing of all those captive turkeys that I had. And we're going to try to go back using new technology and get a better idea of what those good genes consist of. Whether we can see a relationship there between all those ornaments and various genetic patterns. Again, not my specialty. But we started that right at the start of COVID, and that sort of screwed up my learning how to do parts of that, right? And so that's pushed to the back burner, but it's certainly something that I need to follow up on. And I mentioned ocellated turkeys in Belize. I love them. I think they're in trouble. I think they're declining widely in Mesoamerica, and they just have a really tiny range.
Yeah.
And, they're exposed to a lot of poultry diseases now. And people, think they're common because in places where they're not hunted, they can become tame, like at some of the Mayan archaeological sites, right? So you see them all over the place sometimes. But any place they're not protected, you can be pretty sure they're being hunted and poached. And so I haven't had a student working there in a couple of years, but that's certainly something that I would like to get back to soon.
Sure.
So
they're so fascinating.
Yeah.
Ornate, just weird looking thing.
And when I go there, I get to see my curassows as well. So
that's always good.
Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation that I'm sure Marcus and I are probably going to spend several hours rehashing over the next several weeks over the phone, just because you've brought up a lot of ideas that had never even occurred to us before, stimulated some research questions that we never knew we had, and learned a lot in the process. So hopefully we'll be able to have you back on sometime before too long, and I'm sure we'll have more questions at that time.
Yeah, no, our audience is extremely active, and they will let us know if they have questions.
Absolutely.
All right, I'll be glad to answer those questions.
Yeah. Well, we really appreciate you taking time. I agree. This was really fascinating and eye-opening in many ways. Is there anything else that you would like to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I'll leave you with a teaser. So I'd be really interesting to hear from your audience members if they ever heard a turkey hen vocalize as part of her solicitation as part of the crouch, the mating crouch. So some call it the secret vocalization. I've seen it in captive birds. People have told me that they heard from old timers about a female vocalization. So I'm really interested to know whether anyone's actually ever seen it in the wild.
If
So
there's
when
anyone,
crouches,
So when she's in a breeding posture,
Yep. Yeah,
her
is there a
vocalization.
particular vocalization that she makes?
if there's anyone that would have heard that before, it's probably Tess Jolly, and we're hoping to have her on before too
Okay.
long.
Great.
Rich, if you're not familiar with her, she's in just Google her. She's probably world's best turkey photographer. I mean, honestly, like her turkey photography is second to none. And she was just on another podcast that Marcus and I were both listening to recently, and she was talking about some of the things that you've observed as well, like one of which was skullcap width. She was talking about a bird that she followed for, I don't remember, Marcus, what was it, like 7, 8, 9 years?
Oh, wow.
And she said his skullcap width was, this was a completely wild, free-ranging bird, and it was so wide that she couldn't get the catch light in the bird's eyes when she was photographing him.
Right.
And
yeah, she had a name for it. What was
Cool
the-
Whip. Yeah,
Cool Whip. That's right.
Yeah, I've heard so. And his head was incredibly white too, which is
Yeah,
where he got his
looked like
name
a bowl
from.
of Cool
So
Whip on his head.
Wow.
yeah. So Tess may be listening, but if not, I'll make sure and check in with her and ask her if she's ever heard that vocalization.
Well, and that being said, you were talking about getting high quality photographs of males displaying.
Mhm.
Between her and several other really dedicated photographers, there probably are quite a few
Oh, cool.
pictures that from males across the range. Really, so interesting stuff.
Well, thank you again. We really appreciate your time and really enjoyed the conversation.
All right. When do I get my check? Oh, wait. All right, guys. Good to meet you.
Yep.
All right, you too. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.